When William Hurt passed away in 2022, his home in Portland, Oregon, stood empty for nearly a year. A modest yet elegant craftsman-style house built in the 1920s. It wasn't the kind of celebrity mansion one might expect, but it had character: dark-stained wood, heavy beams, and a deep front porch shaded by old, knotted oak trees. Locals whispered that Hurt, known for his quiet and enigmatic personality, had preferred solitude, retreating to this house when he wasn't working. In late 2023, the property was purchased by Mark and Ellen Whitaker, a couple in their mid-40s looking for a fresh start. Mark was a literature professor at a nearby university, and Ellen had recently left her job in advertising to focus on writing a novel. The house seemed perfect, charming, secluded, and filled with the kind of history they both adored. At first, life in the house was idyllic. The floors creaked in a comforting way, the old fireplace crackled at night, and the faint smell of tobacco lingered in the study, as if the walls had absorbed decades of conversations and quiet musings. But as the weeks passed, small oddities became difficult to ignore. Mark was the first to notice. One evening, while grading papers in the study Hurt's old writing room, he distinctly heard the sound of someone clearing their throat behind him. He turned, expecting to see Ellen, but the room was empty. The chair in the corner, an old leather armchair that had belonged to Hurt, seemed to shift slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. Ellen, initially skeptical, started having her own encounters. While working in the kitchen, she would catch movement in the reflection of the antique glass cabinet's shadows passing through the hall when Mark was upstairs. The radio, an old unit left behind in the house, would sometimes crackle to life, playing Jazz Hurt's favorite music before abruptly going silent. Then came the dreams. Ellen began having vivid, almost intrusive dreams of William Hurt, sitting in the study, mumbling lines from old scripts or scribbling notes on yellowed paper. In one particularly unsettling dream, he looked straight at her and whispered, "You need to leave." The final straw came on a stormy January night. Mark had been up late reading when the power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. As he reached for his phone, he heard footsteps, deliberate, slow, moving down the hallway. Assuming it was Ellen, he called her name. No answer. He stepped out into the hall, the dim glow of a street lamp casting elongated shadows across the floor. And then he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, barely illuminated. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A man. Tall, with disheveled blonde-gray hair, wearing a bathrobe, just as Hurt often had. The figure didn't move, didn't advance, just stood there, watching. Mark stumbled back into the study, slamming the door shut. The house was silent again. Too silent. By morning, the decision was made. Within a week, the Whitakers had packed their belongings and put the house back on the market. When questioned, they simply said, "It wasn't the right fit for us." The house has since remained unsold. Realtors struggle to explain why prospective buyers feel uneasy the moment they step inside, why no one stays long. Some say William Hurt never really left. The Whitakers left quietly, slipping away before sunrise on a fog-drenched morning in early February. They told no one of their experiences, not even the real estate agent, who took the news with a weary nod, as if she had expected it. The house, with its leaded glass windows and deep eaves, remained silent as they drove away, its dark silhouette swallowed by the skeletal branches of the old oak trees. For months it stood empty, the "For Sale" sign tilted slightly in the wind, its edges curling from the rain. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering in low voices. The house had never been the kind that welcomed people easily. It held on to things, memories, perhaps, or something else. Then, in late summer, another couple arrived. Travis and Lillian Moore were different from the Whitakers. Younger, livelier. Travis was in his early 30s, an up-and-coming filmmaker with a fascination for old Hollywood, while Lillian was a former journalist turned true crime podcaster. They weren't afraid of stories about haunted houses. In fact, they welcomed them. They joked about it over wine, sitting on the porch swing, their laughter echoing through the stillness of the yard. "Maybe we'll do a whole episode on it," Lillian mused one night, stretching her legs out as she watched the last of the evening light fade through the trees. Hollywood hauntings. The ghosts of actors who can't let go. Travis smirked. You think Hurt would actually haunt this place? He wasn't exactly a dramatic guy. More of a brooding intellectual type. But as the summer nights stretched on, something in the house began to shift. First, it was just a feeling. The weight of unseen eyes. The sensation of someone just having left a room before they entered. The house was old, drafty, full of creaks and settling noises, but some of those sounds didn't feel like the ordinary groans of an aging structure. Footsteps, rhythmic and measured, moved down the hallway late at night when neither of them were up. Then there were the books. One evening, as Travis unpacked boxes in the Hurt study, he noticed something odd. The bookshelves, which had stood bare since the previous owners moved out, were not as empty as he remembered. A single book lay on the middle shelf, slightly pulled forward as if someone had been reading it. It was a weathered copy of A Streetcar Named Desire. He frowned. Neither he nor Lillian had unpacked their books yet. Curious, he picked it up. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges. A name was scrawled inside the front cover in ink that had faded to a pale gray. W. Hurt. A shiver ran down his arms. He turned to call for Lillian. But before he could, something shifted behind him. A deep creak from the leather armchair in the corner. He froze. The chair was empty, but the impression on the cushion looked fresh, as if someone had just stood up. He backed out of the study, closing the door behind him. That night, Lillian woke to the sound of whispering. Not words, just the low murmur of a voice, speaking softly in a rhythm that felt deliberate. She turned her head, expecting to see Travis sitting up, maybe talking in his sleep. But he lay still, his breathing slow, steady. The whispering continued. It was coming from the study. She sat up, her pulse thrumming in her throat. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside, spilling pale orange light through the curtains. The air felt thick, charged, like the moments before a summer storm. The whispering stopped. And then, a footstep. A single, slow step just outside the bedroom door. She held her breath. The wood groaned softly, then fell silent. She didn't wake Travis. She didn't move. She simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds until dawn. The next morning, she found the book. It was on the kitchen table, the cover closed, the pages lying flat. But something was different. The book had been opened to a specific passage. She ran her fingers over the text, her stomach tightening. The words leapt from the page. Don't you ever believe it. Life has got to go on. She looked up, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one there, just the silence of the house. The heavy, knowing silence. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The silence in the house did not feel empty. It was dense, weighted, as if the very walls held breath. Lillian stood at the kitchen table for a long moment, staring at the open book, the phrase curling in her mind like smoke. Don't you ever believe it. Life has got to go on. She ran her fingers over the yellowed pages, feeling their brittle edges, as though by touch alone she could confirm that this was real, that the book had not moved on its own, that someone had placed it there. But Travis had been asleep. She had been asleep. She swallowed against the dry tightness in her throat. The air was thick with the scent of something faintly metallic, almost like old coins. Or blood. From down the hallway, the study door creaked. A long, slow groan of aged hinges shifting under unseen weight. Lillian turned her head sharply toward the sound, heart hammering against her ribs. The house was still. She let out a slow breath, forcing a rational explanation. Houses made noise. Wood expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. The wind outside was strong enough to push against the frame. And yet, the sensation of being watched settled over her again, a prickle along the back of her neck. She left the book on the table and moved toward the hallway. Each step was careful, measured. The hardwood floor was cool beneath her bare feet, the morning light filtering weakly through the lace curtains that hung in the front windows. The air inside the house felt stagnant, as though it had been undisturbed for too long. The study door was open just a crack. Not wide enough to see inside, just enough to suggest movement. just enough to suggest an invitation. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A story she had read once about threshold spirits, the kind that never left their dwelling places, that hovered just behind doors and curtains, waiting. She hesitated at the threshold, pressing her fingertips lightly against the wood. The room beyond was dim. She nudged the door open wider. The chair in the corner, the same one Travis had seen move the night before, faced away from her, its high leather back silhouetted against the bookshelves. Something about it felt occupied. She stepped inside. The air was colder here, a tangible drop in temperature, enough that her arms prickled with goosebumps. The faint scent of tobacco lingered, though neither she nor Travis smoked. She turned her head slightly, listening. No voices, no whispering, just the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. But something had changed in the room. She could feel it before she saw it. The bookcase. A single book had been pulled forward again. Not a streetcar named Desire this time, but another title. She reached out, fingers brushing the spine. Tropic of Cancer. She recognized it immediately, Henry Miller's infamous novel, banned in the U.S. for years before becoming a symbol of artistic defiance. A book of excess, of honesty, of life and death entangled. A book Hurt had once publicly praised in an old interview she had listened to while researching his films. Her throat tightened. Something had chosen this book. For her. From the doorway, a voice low, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. You need to listen. Lillian spun, her pulse surging so hard she felt dizzy. No one was there. The hallway beyond was empty. The room around her held its breath. She did not scream, did not call for Travis. Instead, she reached for the book and pulled it free from the shelf. When she opened it, a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. A page torn from an old notepad, its edges uneven, as if ripped hastily. There was handwriting, faint but still legible. Something is wrong. I can't leave. You need to understand. The air shifted again, colder now, more present. The chair creaked. Lillian turned, staring at the empty seat. The impression on the cushion deepened, as though unseen weight pressed into it. And then, the faintest sound of breath, just behind her ear. The breath against her ear was warm, real. Lillian's own breath caught in her throat, her body locking in place as a deep, instinctual dread rooted her to the floor. The air smelled faintly of stale tobacco and something older, dust, aged leather, the lingering ghost of aftershave. The kind of scent that clung to old jackets hanging too long in a closet, to the pages of books left unread for decades. She did not turn. She wanted to. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to whirl around, to face whoever was behind her. But the moment stretched, thick and endless, and she knew that if she moved too quickly, if she acknowledged it too openly, something would change. Instead, she focused on the note still clenched in her fingers. The handwriting was sharp, angular, written with force. The ink had bled slightly into the paper, as if the pen had been pressed too hard, as if the words had been urgent. Something is wrong. I can't leave. You need to understand. The room was still. The weight in the chair had not lifted. The breath was gone. But something else took its place, a sensation, thick and pressing, wrapping around her like invisible hands gripping her shoulders. Not violent, not yet, but demanding. Lillian exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move. She reached for the bookcase, using it as an anchor, grounding herself in something solid as she turned slowly, deliberately. The chair was empty. The air in the study felt heavy, the way it did just before a summer storm, the kind that made the hairs on your arms stand up before the first crack of thunder. Lillian's fingers tightened around the note. She scanned the room, forcing her breathing to steady. Nothing moved, nothing seen, but the silence had shape. And then, from behind her, a soft rustling. She turned just in time to see the stack of books on the desk slide, shifting as if nudged by an unseen hand. One toppled over, landing face up. The impact was soft, but the noise cut through the quiet like a gunshot. Lillian flinched, her pulse pounding. The book's title was stark against the worn cover. The thin red line, She swallowed. Another film Hurt had starred in. Another message. A cold understanding settled in her chest. This wasn't random. This was intentional. Lillian's mind worked fast, too fast, skipping from thought to thought like a stone skimming the surface of deep water. William Hurt was trying to communicate. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. The question was, why? A noise from the hallway light, almost imperceptible. Footsteps. Not from Travis. She knew his stride. These were different, measured, careful. Lillian's breath caught as a shadow shifted just beyond the doorway. Tall, male. She should have run, should have screamed, should have called Travis, should have left the house entirely. But something inside her curiosity, fear, or something deeper, more inexorable made her step forward instead. The hallway was empty, but the air was different. Not colder, not hostile, something else. A feeling, a weight, a presence, standing just beyond the edge of sight. Lillian's fingers curled around the note, gripping it like a lifeline. She took another step, the wooden floor cool beneath her feet. She opened her mouth. "What do you want?" The silence swallowed her words. And then, the overhead light flickered. A single word whispered through the still air. Faint, nearly lost beneath the hum of the house settling. "Listen." Then, just as quickly as it came, the presence was gone. The house exhaled. Lillian stood there for a long moment, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The note in her hand felt heavier now. She looked down at the handwriting again, tracing the words with her fingertips. "Something is wrong. I can't leave. You need to understand." The sense of urgency lingered in the air, thick and unresolved. And deep in her gut, Lillian knew. This was only the beginning. Lillian did not tell Travis. Not yet. She folded the note carefully, pressing it flat between her palms before slipping it into the pocket of her robe. The air around her was still charged, as if the walls themselves had absorbed whatever had just happened. The silence was no longer empty. It was listening. She moved cautiously down the hallway, each footstep measured, each breath slow. The hardwood creaked beneath her weight, the sound swallowed by the thick hush of the house. She passed the closed guest bedroom, the dim outline of the bathroom door. When she reached the master bedroom, she hesitated, gripping the doorframe for balance. Travis was still asleep. The rise and fall of his breath was slow, peaceful. The blankets were bunched at his waist, one arm flung over his forehead. He hadn't stirred, hadn't heard the books move, the whisper that had breathed against her ear. The normalcy of it was grounding, but it also made the feeling in her chest worse. Lillian slipped back into bed without making a sound. She lay awake until the gray light of morning bled through the curtains. The next day, the air in the house felt different. Not malevolent, but charged, as though something had woken up. Lillian spent most of the morning in the study, tracing her fingers along the bookshelves, looking for anything else out of place. The note sat on the desk beside her, its words staring up at her like a challenge. "Something is wrong. I can't leave. You need to understand." Understand what? She sifted through the books, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The faint smell of tobacco still lingered, clinging to the leather-bound covers. Her fingers ghosted over the spines, pausing when she reached the thin red line, the last book that had been moved. Her pulse quickened. She pulled it free and flipped through the pages, half expecting to find another note. Nothing. But as she turned it over in her hands, she noticed something. A small indentation on the back cover. A faint, almost imperceptible mark. She ran her thumb over it. It wasn't random. It was a number. 1994. Lillian frowned. The book itself had been published decades earlier. The number had to mean something else. A year. She turned toward the desk, reaching for her laptop. The screen glowed as she opened a search window, fingers flying across the keys. William Hurt, 1994. A list of films, interviews, old headlines. And then, a police report. Her breath hitched. She clicked. The article was brief, tucked away in the archives of a forgotten local paper. Car accident. Not Hurt's. A woman's. Evelyn Carter. The name sent a chill down her spine, though she had never heard it before. She read on. Evelyn Carter had been an aspiring actress. A former student of Hertz, from a short-lived acting workshop he had hosted in the early 90s. She had died in a single-vehicle crash late one night on Mulholland Drive. No witnesses, no passengers, no explanation. Lillian exhaled, her throat dry. She skimmed further. The details were scarce. But then, her stomach flipped. The crash happened on February 20th, 1994. She glanced at the corner of her laptop screen. The date glowed back at her. February 20th, 2025. Exactly 31 years later. A low tremor rolled through her body. She looked at the note again. Something is wrong. I can't leave. You need to understand. What if the presence in the house, the voice, the shifting books, the breath against her ear wasn't just hurt? What if it was her? Lillian swallowed hard, closing the laptop. The room felt heavier now, closer. She turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one. Only the chair in the corner, its leather seat faintly depressed, as if someone was still sitting there, waiting. That night, Lillian dreamed. The house was dark, the air thick. A warm breeze carried the scent of asphalt and night-blooming jasmine. She stood at the edge of a winding road. A woman stood a few feet away, dressed in a pale blue blouse, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was young, maybe mid-20s, her expression unreadable. Her eyes locked onto Lillian's. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the world around them lurched. Headlights bloomed in the darkness, blinding, barreling toward them too fast, too fast. Lillian woke with a gasp, heart slamming against her ribs. She sat up, breath coming hard. The room was silent, but at the foot of the bed, a single sheet of paper. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. With trembling hands, she reached for it. The handwriting was the same as before, only 2 words this time. Find me. A cold shudder ran through her body. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that it hadn't been left by hurt. Evelyn was here too, and she wasn't leaving. Not until someone finally listened. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.